Hold, Dynamund!" The guard's shout cut through the sudden howl of the prairie wind, but the damage was done. The Texas sun was dying, bleeding gold and fire across the horizon. Dust, fine as flour, drifted relentlessly across the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Hearn, one of the hidden prisoner of war facilities scattered across the Lone Star State in the late autumn of 1944. The air was a thick, volatile mix, the scent of dry hay, honest sweat, and the lingering smoke from the mess hall fires. As the last exhausted work detail returned from the cotton fields, the prisoners, both men and a small number of women, shuffled into line for evening roll call. Among the women stood Helga Volmer, a 28-year-old German field nurse captured during the chaos of the Allied landings in France and shipped halfway across the world to a place she knew only from fear-mongering propaganda leaflets. America, the land of the enemy. She still held the stiff, almost defiant posture of military discipline, her flaxen hair meticulously pinned beneath a thin, worn kerchief, her face already showing the deep burn of the relentless Texas sun. Across the dusty yard, watching the scene with the detached, weary eye of a rancher, stood Sergeant Clay, Dusty Rhodes. Tall, broad-shouldered, his Stetson tilted low to ward off the glare. He was the kind of man who conserved his words but noticed every single flicker of emotion. He was not a soldier by choice, merely a seasoned rancher reluctantly drafted into a uniform and assigned to guard German POWs, because he knew the needs of a horse better than the mechanism of a rifle. To him, these captives were no longer foes. They were simply hired farmhands now, temporary labor. The whistle blew, sharp and piercing, signaling evening dismissal. The POWs began to break ranks, dispersing toward their separate barracks, their German conversation a low, continuous murmur. Then, a sudden, fierce gust of prairie wind, a true Texas blow, tore through the compound. Helga Volmer's flimsy kerchief, weakened by wear, was snatched violently from her head, tumbling across the dirt yard toward the corral fence. She froze instantly, paralyzed by the ingrained military law that prohibited unnecessary movement. War is discipline. Never break ranks. Before her mind could even process a reaction, Sergeant Rhodes took 3 decisive steps. He bent, picked up his own, sweat-stained Stetson, and with a simple, deliberate motion, placed it gently, wordlessly, upon her head. The entire camp went silent. The American guards, leaning on their rifles or chatting casually, stopped talking and stared. The German men, watching from behind their own barbed wire, gasped audibly in profound disbelief. Helga stood utterly still, the heavy, unfamiliar weight of the cowboy hat dipping low over her eyes. Her hands trembled, unsure whether to execute a sharp military thank you or to recoil from the forbidden gesture. Rhodes simply nodded once, a quick, casual affirmation, then turned away, his boots crunching methodically in the dust. In that single, suspended moment, something profound shifted in the air. The gesture was small, a momentary exchange of hats, but it carried the immense, unspoken weight of something forbidden. A lightning strike crack in the fortified wall that separated conqueror from conquered, captor from captive. That night, in the small Spartan women's barracks, Helga sat awake on her cot, her hands resting on the wide, felt brim of the hat. It smelled overwhelmingly of sun-baked leather, honest tobacco, and the dry, clean scent of the open range. She could not stop turning over its meaning, the fact that a man wearing the uniform of the enemy had shown her something her own proud officers never had: respect. The next morning, the whispers traveled through the camp with the speed of the wind itself. Der Cowboy gab ihr seinen Hut. The cowboy gave her his hat. The guards, when questioned by the German officers, merely shrugged and said nothing. By noon, the moment had already passed into the realm of legend. Before Helga Volmer ever saw Texas, she had been told exactly what to expect from the Americans. Back in 1943, working in the underground field hospitals of occupied France, German radio broadcasts had relentlessly painted the United States as a nation of moral brutes, a chaotic land where captured soldiers were beaten, women were violated, and prisoners were worked mercilessly until death. Never surrender to the Anglo-Saxons, her grim-faced commanding nurse had warned, They are not civilized people. Those words had clung to her like a curse through the trauma of capture, the terrifying chaos of the Allied landings, and the cold, terrifying voyage across the Atlantic. When the prison train finally pulled into the vast, glaring Texas plains and the car doors rattled open to the brutal light and heat, she had braced every nerve for humiliation and violence. What she found instead was a baffling, disorienting contradiction. The guards did not shout. They politely offered water. One lean, weathered sergeant joked that the German prisoners looked like they could use a steak and a nap. It was not the ruthless, fanatical enemy she had been so thoroughly trained to fear. Still, deep suspicion ran thick on both sides of the fence. For many of the American guards, the war was painfully personal. They had brothers dead in North Africa, sons missing in the U-boat-infested Atlantic, and friends lost in the icy hell of the European front. "Feed the devils that killed our boys?" One grizzled ranch hand muttered angrily near the stables. "It ain't right." Yet the iron policy of the U.S. Army was utterly clear. Prisoners of war would be treated strictly according to the Geneva Convention. This meant fair food, immediate medical care, and work performed under rigidly humane conditions. The global war might rage savagely across the oceans, but here, on American soil, decency would be the silent, defining victory. Still, rumors persisted. Local citizens, driven by morbid curiosity, often drove out to the camp fences just to see the captured women for themselves. They expected to find hardened, cruel zealots. Instead, they saw tired, heavily sunburned faces, women who looked dishearteningly similar to their own sisters, wives, and neighbors. Inside the camp, the German prisoners were equally unsettled. Many found it impossible to reconcile the strange, benign reality of their captivity with the image of America they had been drilled to believe. "The Americans smile too easily," one woman wrote nervously in her journal. "It feels like a trick." A subtle torture. When Helga was assigned to work in the camp infirmary, she maintained a deliberate, icy distance from the guards. Every casual laugh from a cowboy made her tense with suspicion. Every small, kind gesture felt like a complex test she was destined to fail. She carried herself with quiet, unyielding defiance, refusing to speak English, refusing to soften her rigid posture. But as the weeks passed, the formidable barriers began to crack in small, human ways. A quick, shared chuckle when a mule brayed comically. A silent, mutual nod of acknowledgement over difficult morning chores. A moment of awkward, unbidden respect when a tall, quiet cowboy helped one of the older women lift an impossibly heavy water barrel. The propaganda on both sides had been built on a single, powerful foundation: fear. Fear of the other, fear of internal betrayal, and the crippling fear that compassion itself might be a fatal weakness. Yet, it was precisely this steady, pervasive compassion that began the slow, inevitable undoing of the cherished myths. By the end of that first month, Helga could no longer pretend she was surrounded by the monsters of the newsreels. They were merely men in dusty boots, working long, back-breaking hours under the same, neutral sun. And though no one dared to say it aloud, something utterly unthinkable was slowly starting to form: trust. By the critical year of 1944, the United States had transformed into one vast, hidden archipelago of barbed wire and wooden towers, a covert empire of prisoner-of-war camps stretching from the frigid Great Plains all the way to the humid Gulf Coast. Texas, with its immense empty space and its strong agricultural backbone, became the literal beating heart of this massive network. There were nearly 70 established POW facilities across the state, from the dense pine woods of Huntsville to the arid, shimmering dust of Hereford. Camp Hearn alone housed close to 5,000 prisoners, a small, functioning city of captured Axis soldiers, including the small, anomalous handful of women nurses, clerical workers, and auxiliaries swept up in the final, panicked collapses of occupied France. For many Texans, the entire concept of female prisoners of war was almost incomprehensible, but the U.S. Army had a clear, relentless logic driving the program. The war had consumed manpower at home. The ranches needed labor. Cotton, wheat, and produce needed urgent harvesting. The men who would have done those jobs were now overseas fighting. German POW. POWs, and later, women like Helga became the unexpected, efficient solution. Texas ranchers were initially deeply skeptical. The thought of trusting German captives to mend fences, care for high-value livestock, or pick sensitive cotton crops seemed, at best, utterly insane. Yet, when the first work details went out under guard, something entirely remarkable took place. Productivity soared. The Germans, fueled by a rigid work ethic and a silent desire to prove their own worth, worked hard, efficiently, and often with fierce dedication, even in captivity. And the Texans, bound by their own sacred, unwritten code of fairness, treated them with a level of respect that astonished the POWs. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, POWs were legally required to be paid for their labor, albeit in camp tokens rather than U.S. currency. At the camp canteen, those tokens bought essential luxuries: cigarettes, bottles of Coca-Cola, genuine chocolate, and postcards, small comforts that had long vanished in war-torn Europe. For many prisoners, those tokens became worth more than mere money. They were tangible proof of their dignity. Conditions were vastly better than anything the prisoners had been led to expect. They lived in weather-tight wooden barracks with electricity, running water, and reliable medical care. They received mail from home, had access to donated libraries, and were even allowed musical instruments. Some camps organized entire theater performances and printed their own newspapers in the German language. But beneath the surface, a persistent, uneasy tension remained: the moral contradiction of comfort in captivity. Every newspaper that reached the camp carried fresh headlines detailing the wholesale destruction of their homeland. Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg. The exact same nation that provided them with abundant food and fair treatment was simultaneously, relentlessly turning their country to ash. When the first group of female POWs arrived in Texas, they were treated as an alarming anomaly. The guards truly did not know whether to be strictly disciplined or simply polite. The women, in turn, did not know whether to respond with fear or tentative trust. The unspoken rules of engagement were rewritten daily. Helga Volmer's group of 22 women were billeted in a separate, small compound within the main camp. Their work was primarily agricultural, picking vegetables, milking cows, and sorting livestock feed. Their guards were mostly local reservists and older cowboys, men who had a deep, quiet respect for the land and who preferred the company of horses to the company of rifles. They often referred to the women, with a mix of curiosity and old-fashioned manners, as the Fräuleins. One of those men was Sergeant Clay Dusty Rhodes, the rancher who had lost 2 brothers to the fighting in Europe. When he was first told he'd be guarding Hitler's women, he had laughed bitterly, the sound rough and painful. But the first time he watched them step off the transport truck, thin, heavily sunburned, their eyes hollowed by shock, but still fiercely proud, something deep inside his heart unexpectedly softened. "These ain't Nazis," he told Dr. Harlan, the camp medic, later that evening. "They're just people who ran out of luck and lost a fight." The POW, a program in Texas, would eventually become one of the most logistically successful in American history. The ranches thrived, the local economy boomed, and more than one Texan found himself quietly rethinking what the word enemy truly meant. But for Helga and Sergeant Rhodes, that profound moral transformation was about to become deeply personal, witnessed by the silent audience of an entire camp. War is typically measured in the number of men killed or the tons of steel built. But in Texas, it could be measured in something far different. How many fresh loaves of bread were baked? How many acres were successfully plowed? How many small, almost insignificant acts of decency slipped quietly through the great, gaping cracks of hatred? By the close of 1944, the U.S. Army was officially holding over 376,000 Axis prisoners across the expanse of America. Texas alone accounted for nearly 70,000 of them, the largest single concentration of POWs on American soil. Every day, these camps functioned with breathtaking mundane clockwork: 400,000 meals prepared, 1.3 million acres of farmland efficiently worked, thousands of letters carefully censored, stamped, and sent back across the Atlantic. The sheer logistics were staggering, a testament to industrial power. Each prisoner received a minimum of 3,200 calories a day, significantly more than many Americans lived on with wartime rationing, and immeasurably more than German civilians struggling through endemic shortages. The rations were not meager, tasteless military fare, either. There were eggs, fresh bread, butter, garden vegetables, real coffee, and even the occasional, prized Sunday roast. In total, American taxpayers spent nearly $1.2 billion maintaining the POW system. This was money that could have been directed toward munitions or aircraft, but was instead deliberately spent to feed the enemy. It was a strategic decision as much as a moral one. The War Department wanted to prove that the American way of life, fair treatment, rigid order, and undeniable efficiency was fundamentally stronger than any ideology built on fear and scarcity. The German prisoners noticed this stark contrast. They compared notes, whispering late at night in the barracks about the quality of their treatment. "If this is how they treat their enemies," one man reportedly said, "then how do they treat their friends?" That question haunted many of them. Meanwhile, official reports from Europe painted grim pictures of starvation in Hamburg and desperation in Dresden. Families wrote home of bombed streets, rampant black markets, and children scavenging desperately for scraps of bread. In Texas, those same Germans were picking fresh peaches from ranch trees and drinking cold Coca-Cola during their work breaks. The contrast was morally unbearable. Guilt mixed inextricably with gratitude, and profound shame clashed violently with disbelief. Helga Volmer saw this same complex paradox in her daily work. As a qualified nurse, she was assigned to help treat minor injuries among both the prisoners and the guards. A twisted ankle, a severe sunburn, the rare rattlesnake bite all received the exact same professional care. The camp doctor, Dr. Harlan, a gruff but fundamentally kind American medic, often joked to the staff, "In this place, blood is just blood. It don't wear a flag." That core sentiment, more than any grand speech, began the slow, internal shift in minds. The statistics told one story: industrial power, logistical perfection, the relentless machine of American abundance. But what those numbers elegantly concealed was something far deeper: the moral arithmetic of mercy. Every meal shared, every cigarette offered, every hat passed across a fence post inexorably eroded the foundation of Nazi propaganda. These POWs had been raised to believe in conquest and dominance, taught explicitly that mercy was weakness. Yet here, in the open, unyielding heat of Texas, mercy was the system itself. It was organized, deliberate, and utterly relentless. One historian would later write, "The United States did not just win World War II with weapons. It won with calories, engines, and conscience." In that new math of humanity, the balance was already tilting. Every kind act added a heavy, profound weight to the scale, and one unforgettable afternoon, with a cowboy's simple, quiet gesture, the sum of those small mercies would unexpectedly become immortal. The days at Camp Hearn followed a strict, punishing rhythm that even global war could not disrupt. Reveille at dawn, roll call, work details, lunch under the vast open sky, evening assembly, and lights out promptly by 10. But for Helga Volmer, each day had begun to feel less like a harsh punishment and more like something far stranger, a kind of uneasy, unexpected peace. Her work crew had been permanently assigned to a nearby, sprawling ranch where German prisoners harvested cotton and helped tend the valuable livestock. The guards were quintessential Texans, men who could effortlessly rope a steer faster than they could read a map, men who had learned their patience from the stubborn logic of cattle, not from the strictures of a classroom. Among them was Sergeant Clay Dusty Rhodes. He had grown up no more than 20 miles from the camp, the son of a rancher who had fought in the previous Great War. Joe had willingly volunteered after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, lost 2 beloved brothers to the relentless war in Europe, and somehow ended up guarding the very people he blamed, with justified fury, for their deaths. When the first trucks carrying German women arrived, his initial reaction had been a deep, burning resentment. "They're the enemy, damn it. Not guests," he'd muttered bitterly to the camp medic. But anger, Sergeant Rhodes was quickly learning, is difficult to sustain under the endless, dehydrating Texas sun. When he first encountered Helga, she was struggling and failing to lift a feed sack that was nearly her own weight. She refused help, even as the sack slipped and violently burst, spilling precious grain across the dirt floor. The other prisoners laughed at her futile struggle. Rhodes didn't. He simply walked over, silently handed her an empty replacement sack, and said, his voice quiet and without judgment, "Try again, Mum." The use of the word Mum, a term of deep reflexive respect, utterly stunned her. No German soldier, officer or enlisted had ever spoken to her like that. She straightened, swallowed the bitter taste of her pride, and tried again. He did not laugh when she stumbled. He did not shout. He simply watched with that calm, steady, knowing look of a man who had seen both tragedy and drought and learned not to rush either one. That night in the barracks, Helga lay awake, the question a burning coal in her mind. Why would an American show me respect? What is this elaborate, subtle game? Over the following weeks, she saw Rhodes often. He patiently taught the women how to tie the heavy feed bags efficiently, how to properly balance bales on the backs of stubborn mules, and how to use a low, calming whistle to quiet the skittish horses. He rarely offered a full smile, but when he did, it was genuine and unforced, the kind of simple, honest smile that made the other guards look away and allowed the prisoners to forget, for a brief moment, that a vast war was raging. Helga's English improved slowly, word by painful word. She mastered, "Thank you," "Good morning," and the crucial phrase, "Too hot." Rhodes, in turn, picked up a few fractured German words. When he offered her water, he'd grin and say, "Wasser." She would roll her eyes at his pronunciation, but always accept the drink. Then came the day the hat blew off. A windstorm swept through the cotton fields without warning, scattering papers, dust, and debris. Helga's kerchief was snatched cleanly from her head and carried violently toward the perimeter corral. She instinctively reached for it, then froze solid. The guard shouted, "Hold!" and the wind howled louder. Before she could process the danger, Rhodes stepped forward, his own hat already in his hand. He did not hesitate. He did not ask permission. He simply placed his Stetson, sweat-stained, sun-bleached, unmistakably his own, on her head. It fit awkwardly, the wide brim dipping low over her startled eyes. The guard stopped moving. The prisoners fell silent. The air held its breath. The hat had crossed the line, instantly dissolving the emotional barrier between enemy and equal. Helga's throat tightened with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since her capture, she felt visible, profoundly human. Not as a nurse, not as a German, not as a prisoner, but simply as a person. Rhodes nodded once, turned away, and went back to checking the water troughs, behaving as if nothing at all significant had occurred. But for everyone else in that camp, something invisible, something monumental, had irreversibly shifted. That night, the story spread like a sacred fire. The cowboy had given a German woman his hat not as an order, not as a punishment, but as an act of fundamental respect. And respect, it turned out, was far more dangerous to old hatreds than any weapon ever conceived. For years, both sides had meticulously built their identities on deliberate illusions. To the zealous Germans, America was a soft, decadent land, a country of jazz, chewing gum, and mechanical overindulgence. To the angry Americans, Germany was a brutal machine of cold fanaticism, ruthless, unfeeling, built entirely on obedience and cruelty. At Camp Hearn, those deeply ingrained myths were colliding in real time, and neither side was prepared for the math of what they revealed. The Reich's propaganda had fiercely claimed that surrender was worse than death itself. Film reels depicted Allied POW camps as places of profound humiliation and starvation. Better to die as a soldier than live as a slave, the official posters had screamed. But now, here in the heart of Texas, the numbers simply did not match the narrative. Each German prisoner was issued a comfortable mattress, given 3 full meals, and guaranteed 8 hours of rest per night. They were paid for their physical labor. Every week, they could purchase Coca-Cola, genuine cigarettes, and write postcards home. Some camps even boasted orchestras and art classes, and printed their own newsletters filled with poetry and jokes. Helga had been raised under the Nazi conviction that compassion was weakness, that mercy was a soft luxury only the absolute victors could afford. Yet, here she was, living, breathing proof of the precise opposite. America's mercy was systemic, not sentimental. It ran on predictable schedules and meticulously managed supply chains. The same devastating efficiency that built the B-17 bombers was now, with equal discipline, feeding the enemy. Meanwhile, word of this strange, unyielding civility reached back across the distant Atlantic. Letters sent from Texas POWs, slipping quietly past the censors, made their way to terrified families in Munich and Bremen. "The Americans treat us fairly," one POW. He wrote, "We have meat, coffee, music. They even let us work with the horses." By the early months of 1945, German morale began to fracture not primarily from defeat on the battlefield, but from the quiet, devastating shock that their enemy had not, in fact, become the monster they had been told to fear. Even among the guards, the cognitive dissonance was a palpable force. Sergeant Rhodes's commanding officer once asked him pointedly, "You going soft on those Krauts, Carter?" Rhodes had simply shrugged, the dust rising off his uniform. "Just doing my job, sir. Feeding folks, not fighting them." But everyone in the barracks knew the complex truth. Sergeant Rhodes had fundamentally changed. That small, spontaneous act of giving his hat had spread through the camp like a contagion. Guards began greeting prisoners by name. Prisoners stopped deliberately spitting in the dirt when Americans passed. The wire fences remained physically in place, but the vital emotional distance between the two sides shrank daily. Helga, too, began to change. The bitter, freezing anger she'd carried from Europe, the self-righteous belief that her suffering was noble and her cause just, began to dissolve under the ceaseless sun. One morning, while serving coffee in the infirmary, she overheard two guards joking about sending the fancy German Mercedes cars to the scrap heap. She surprised herself by letting out a small, genuine laugh. For the first time, she felt she truly understood their humor, their strange, resilient ability to laugh at the tragedy, a vital skill for surviving it. This was the quiet, undeniable collapse math of ideology. When exposure to kindness meticulously dismantled everything cruelty had so deliberately built. In Germany, Hitler's speeches promised total victory through total hardness, steel against weakness, racial purity against human softness. But the war's ultimate arithmetic was no longer in his favor. The Americans had proven that empathy could be industrial, organized, even economically profitable. Every single POW working a Texas ranch freed one American soldier to fight elsewhere. Every single loaf of bread shared was a calculation, not just charity. The Nazi dream depended entirely on dehumanization. The American system survived on humanization. By the spring of 1945, even the German prisoners could clearly see the equation's outcome. One side was rapidly running out of fuel and faith. The other was running on organized compassion and limitless supplies of cornflakes. For Helga, that realization came not through official statistics, but through a single devastating gesture. A hat, a word, a silence in the Texas dusk that felt infinitely more powerful than any speech. By April 1945, the grim rumors had reached Camp Hearn. Germany was collapsing. Prisoners whispered the words, "Berlin surrounded," with stunned disbelief. The war that had defined every breath of their lives was dissolving, thousands of miles away. But in Texas, the sky remained brilliantly blue, the air smelled of mesquite wood, and the camp radio played upbeat swing music every sunset. One afternoon, after completing her shift in the infirmary, Helga was granted permission to write a final, uncensored letter home. She sat at a rickety wooden desk in the camp library, a quiet, sacred space lined with donated, dusty encyclopedias and a large, almost defiant American flag tacked to the far wall. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, her hand trembling slightly. This time, she resolved to write only the plain, absolute truth. The words came slowly at first, then with a rushing speed. "Dear Mama, I am alive. Texas is nothing like the war. It is hot, dry, and so wide that the horizon never ends. The people are strange, loud and proud, but they are not cruel. She paused, then continued, pouring out the complex truth. We are treated with fairness. We work with animals and crops. Sometimes the guards share coffee with us. One man gave me his hat. I do not understand why. Perhaps to them, mercy is a kind of strength. That single, profound sentence, mercy is a kind of strength, would pass effortlessly through the censor's hands, entirely unmarked, and slip across the vast ocean to a bombed-out home in Bremen. There, her mother, huddled in a cold, dark apartment, would read it aloud to her desperate neighbors. It spread from house to house like an essential spark in the dark. The Americans are not like the propaganda said. They are strong because they are kind. Back in Texas, Sergeant Rhodes heard that Helga had written a lengthy letter. He didn't ask what it said, but he knew its essence. One afternoon, while bringing in the water barrels, he stopped near the women's barracks and leaned on the fence. "You write home?" he asked, his voice low. Helga nodded. "Yes, I told them." She paused, searching for the precise English word. "You are not evil." Rhodes chuckled softly. Well, that's a start." She smiled, the first genuine, unburdened one he had ever seen from her. "Maybe next letter I tell them you have no horns." He tipped his hat, laughing openly now. "Don't ruin our reputation completely." That exchange, brief, almost playful, would ripple far beyond the two of them. It was how wars truly end, long before the elaborate treaties are signed in the moment when enemies start to laugh at the same joke. Weeks later, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Texas camps began their final preparations for the inevitable: surrender, liberation, repatriation. The guards grew quieter. The prisoners wrote more and more letters. Everyone sensed that the war's relentless math was shifting toward its final, brutal sum. Helga still wore the cowboy hat sometimes, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, an artifact of something more profound than mere peace: recognition. That night, she added a final sobering line to her journal before the lights went out. "Perhaps we were wrong about who the barbarians were. May 8th, 1945. The morning sun rose over the Texas plains just like any other, but something in the air was profoundly different. Lighter, quieter, almost reverent. The camp loudspeakers, usually reserved for shouted roll calls and orders, crackled with sudden static. Then came the steady, deliberate voice of the camp commander. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally." For a long, paralyzing moment, no one moved. The prisoners stood frozen in the dusty yard, the only sound the wind whispering through the fences. Then came the murmurs, first in stunned disbelief, then in profound grief. Some men slowly removed their caps. Others stared sightlessly at the ground. A few simply turned away, their eyes hollowed by the sudden finality. Helga Volmer felt her knees weaken. She had known it was coming. The rumors had been undeniable. But hearing the official announcement made it terrifyingly real. The Reich was gone. The flags, the salutes, the iron-willed certainty that had defined her entire adult life, all of it had dissolved into meaningless static. Across the yard, Sergeant Rhodes watched silently. He had been issued no special orders for the day, only to keep things calm. But calm wasn't what he saw. He saw shock, genuine heartbreak, deep confusion, and strangely, a flicker of profound relief. One German officer, his uniform still impeccably pressed and perfect, stood rigid in the center of the yard and shouted, "Lies! All lies!" His voice cracked, echoing pitifully off the barracks walls. A nearby guard instinctively raised his rifle, but Rhodes quickly lowered the man's barrel. "Let him shout," he said quietly. "He's already lost everything that made him dangerous." Later that afternoon, a small group of prisoners gathered by the perimeter fence. The guards did not stop them. They stood together in silence, staring out at the vast, empty land that now seemed to mock the total collapse of their empire. Helga sat slightly apart from the others, the cowboy hat resting gently in her lap. The brim was frayed, the band darkened with sweat, but it felt like the single most valuable thing she owned. Rhodes approached her slowly, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. "Heard the news?" he asked softly. She nodded. "It is finished." "Yep," he said. sitting down heavily on the other side of the fence. "World's a mighty small place now." Helga's eyes unexpectedly filled with tears, the first he had ever seen from her. "All that we believed. Gone," she whispered. "Everything." Rhodes took a long, steady sip of his coffee, watching the sun dip low over the plains. "Sometimes that's the only way you get to start over," he said. They sat there in silence as the last light faded. Behind them, the camp loudspeakers played a crackling, reverent rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner. Some prisoners stood for it, others did not, but no one mocked it. At dinner that night, something truly extraordinary happened. The mess hall served basic fare: bacon, bread, and beans. Nothing special. But before the guards could even begin eating, a German prisoner, a young corporal from the engineers, stood up and bravely raised his cup. "To peace," he said in slow, broken English. The room fell still. Then, slowly, every man and woman, German and American alike, raised their cups. For the first time since the war began, no one in that camp was truly on opposite sides. Later that night, Rhodes walked his final patrol alone. As he passed the women's barracks, he saw Helga sitting by the window, the hat still on her head, looking out toward the impossibly bright stars. She noticed him and nodded once, a simple, silent acknowledgement. He nodded back. No words were needed. The war that had divided them had ended with a quiet, mutual exchange beneath the same sky, a soldier and a prisoner, both left to wonder what peace would demand of them next. The surrender of Germany ended a global nightmare, but inside Camp Hearn, it ended something far more intimate. The war that lived inside people's hearts. For months, hatred had been a reflexive response, and distrust a daily habit. But now, in the strange, profound quiet after the news, something fundamentally different took root. The prisoners were no longer enemies. They were simply people waiting to go home, if home still miraculously existed. The guards were no longer watchmen. They were caretakers of history's slow, complex aftermath. And between them stood the quiet, undeniable symbols of small humanity. A cowboy hat, a tin cup of coffee, a shared silence under the same stars. Helga wore the hat every single day until the transport orders finally came. To the Americans, it had become a harmless camp curiosity. To the Germans, it was something sacred, a sign that fundamental dignity could survive, even in crushing defeat. When Rhodes found out she was being transferred to a transit camp in Louisiana for repatriation, he said nothing at first. He simply approached her at the final roll call and held out his calloused hand. "You'll be going home soon," he said. "Home's a good thing." Helga nodded, her eyes glistening. "What if there is no home?" Rhodes hesitated, looking out at the endless prairie. "Then you build one, ma'am." She smiled, a tired, fragile smile, and finally took his hand. "You gave me more than a hat." "Joe," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "You gave me back my name." In her final letter written from Camp Hearn, Helga wrote, "War taught us how to destroy. Texas taught me how to live again." When the train pulled out that night, the few remaining guards stood silently by the tracks, watching the prisoners wave through the open slats. Rhodes lifted his hand in a silent farewell, his silhouette framed by the firelight from the station lamps. Helga pressed the wide brim of the hat against the glass and whispered, "Danke." The sound was lost in the wind, but Rhodes heard it anyway. Years later, historians would write volumes about the massive American war machine, the tanks, the planes, the ships. But few would ever mention the quieter, deeper victories, the simple mercy in a sun-baked Texas field, the respect that crossed the barrier of barbed wire, the one small gesture that ultimately dismantled an empire's biggest lie. Because when the numbers were finally tallied, the bombs dropped, the lives lost, one truth stood entirely apart. The United States hadn't just won the war with steel and fuel, it had won it with the human heart. In the small, dusty archives of Camp Hearn, a photograph still survives. A young German woman in a cowboy hat looking straight into the camera, her eyes calm, almost smiling. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Given by Joe Carter, 1945, hat returned by mail, 1952. No one knows what became of Helga Volmer after she left Texas. But in that small final note, history left a profound message of its own. that wars end not when treaties are signed, but when mercy becomes memory. The cowboy hat, once just a piece of leather and sweat, had become something infinitely greater, a quiet monument to the day compassion defeated ideology. When the last POW trains finally left Texas in 1946, the ranches went quiet again. The barbed wire came down, the lonely guard towers were emptied, and the camps were slowly reclaimed by the endless prairie. Within a few short years, wild grass covered the parade grounds where once soldiers had marched, the fences rusted away, and the past faded into dust and legend. But not all traces disappeared. The enduring legacy of those improbable years, when bitter enemies became tentative neighbors, and war gradually softened into humanity, remained in the small, ordinary artifacts. A hat hanging on a wall, a letter preserved in a family chest, a faded photograph of a German girl smiling under a huge Texas sky. For many of the POWs, their time in America was far more than mere captivity. It was a devastating, total revelation. They had been meticulously raised on propaganda that painted Americans as cruel, godless monsters. Yet, they found something entirely different. Cowboys who shared their last cigarette, guards who let them listen to the forbidden radio, and cooks who gave them bacon and coffee every morning. It utterly shattered the lies they'd been taught, and in that shattering came something far stronger than defeat: understanding. Helga Volmer's story became one of thousands that quietly echoed across post-war Europe. Some POWs wrote back to their captors, sending photos of new families and newborn children. Others returned decades later, traveling back to stand in the open, quiet fields where the camps had once stood, hat in hand, remembering the completely unexpected kindness of strangers. Historians would later accurately describe America's POW program as the most humane in history. But for those who actually lived it, no policy or statistic could ever capture what truly happened. The war had ended in blood and fire across continents, but here in Texas, it ended with mercy, an act of grace profoundly disguised as ordinary decency. Sergeant Clay Dusty Rhodes never saw Helga again. He went back to ranching, raising cattle through endless summers of drought and hard winters of dust. But sometimes, when the cooling evening wind moved through the plains, he would look west and think about that young woman who had crossed oceans and ideologies just to learn what kindness felt like. He kept one relic from the war, a letter written in careful, slightly foreign handwriting. It read, "Dear Joe, you taught me something no book or flag ever could. You taught me that goodness is stronger than hate, that freedom means not having to hate anyone. Thank you for the hat, for the laughter, and for the silence we shared. Signed simply, Anna." The letter yellowed over the years, but the words endured, unmarred. In the end, that was Texas's quiet, true miracle. Not victory achieved through weapons, but redemption earned through simple decency. The cowboys and the prisoners, the guards and the captives, they had all come to understand the same fundamental truth: that war may divide nations, but humanity can still unite hearts. The narrative would fade out on a final image: a lone cowboy riding slowly across the horizon, the sun setting behind him in a blaze of silent fire, the brim of his hat catching the last, lingering light. And somewhere, far away in post-war Germany, a woman would look at that same endless sky and remember a time when even prisoners were free, if only for a moment, in the warmth of Texas kindness.